All right, well, welcome everyone to this Dionysus Circle discussion. Today we are very honored to host Dr. Eric Perl of Loyola Marymount University. Dr. Perl is a contemporary philosopher working within the Neoplatonic tradition. In 2007, he released a great book on Dionysius called Theophany, and where he appealed to Neoplatonism in order to give a rigorous philosophical exposition of central Dionysian doctrines. And today we're going to be discussing his recent article published last year called Into the Dark, where Dr. Perl deals with the ultimate why question. Why is there anything at all rather than nothing? So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Perl.
Hey. So thanks for having me. This article actually took its start in a fit of rage when I completely accidentally stumbled on the paper by Peter van Inwagen that I cite in the article. And it just struck me as just so completely and utterly wrongheaded, completely missing the point, utterly failing to see what is being asked when you ask, why is there being rather than nothing, or why is there anything at all? And I was all the more enraged by it because he's a very big name, and this is very prominent, very extremely highly regarded philosopher of religion, and this article is just so absolutely imbecilic, and so I was outraged by it. And as I cite him, he starts right off deflating the question, saying we don't need to panic, it's not such a big deal, and then it becomes very clear why. Because he says that, let me read the quotation, which is really where all of this takes off from. It's on page 181 of my paper, for a little further down. Right there, where he says, by a being, I mean a concrete object, whatever that may mean. Notice he admits that he doesn't even know that. But anyway, I do not think that the question people have actually intended to ask when they ask why anything at all should exist could be answered by pointing out that the number of 510 would exist no matter what. If the notion of an abstract object makes sense at all, it seems evident that if everything were an abstract object, if the only objects are abstract objects, there is an obvious and perfect good sense in which there would be nothing at all. For there would be no physical things, no stuffs, no events, no space, no time, no Cartesian egos, no. When people want to know why there is anything at all, they want to know why that bleak state of affairs does not obtain. And my immediate thought was, no, they don't. They want to know, why is there being? Why is there anything at all? No exceptions, no distinctions, nothing. Why is there reality? And the words that just kept running through my mind were the words from Thomas Aquinas: being falls first in the conception of intellect. There cannot be any more comprehensive notion, idea, thought, category, class. There cannot be anything more comprehensive within which you could then distinguish being from something else, which is what he tries to do. And he says being includes only concrete objects, and then there may also be abstract objects. No, the question, the question is, why is there reality at all? And perhaps I should add that I have never, for the life of me, been able to see why as so many people say, why the unthinkability of an alternative makes the question meaningless. It's a meaningful question, even if there is no alternative. I hope that it comes across in the paper that it's in part, therefore, a kind of this is my one and only engagement with analytic philosophy. And I hope it comes across that this is a kind of a comic send-up of analytic philosophy, exposing its total incapacity even to see the question, even to think being, to recognize what being means. You see the same thing in one of my footnotes from Brian Davies, an analytic Thomist, who starts off all right, but then he says, when we say that God explains why there is something rather than nothing, nothing doesn't mean absolutely nothing. It only means empirical things or something, something like that, which is not what Thomas says. And then once again, totally fails to understand what is meant by being and what is meant by nothing. So what I tried to do in the first part of the paper is simply lay out what it really means to ask, why is there being at all? That what's being put in question here is everything, with absolutely no exceptions whatsoever. So that, as I then try to show in the third part of the paper with Plotinus and Proclus and Aquinas, God, or to be more general, the first principle, because you can't really simply equate the one of Neoplatonism with God in a monotheistic sense. But in any case, God, or the first principle, does not account for the world, not intended to account for the world in the sense of the universe, the physical universe, but rather for being as such, for reality as such. And that's what you really actually find in Plotinus, in Proclus, and in Thomas Aquinas. You see in the footnote reference to Lawrence Duan. He saw that. It's also, as I mentioned, you can see it if you take the Nicene Creed seriously. Maker of heaven and earth and of all things. No exceptions, just all things. And all things means what it says. All things. That includes the number 510 and anything else at all whatsoever. So in that sense, creation, as understood in that sense, does not mean the making of the physical universe. It's not a cosmological doctrine. It's a metaphysical doctrine. It's describing the dependence of being as such. And therefore, of course, it follows that the first principle, immediately we should be able to see, cannot be included in being or in reality, which is also something you see if you read the rest of Van Inwagen's article, when he does talk a bit in a totally silly way about God. It's quite clear that his notion of God, or his hypothetical God, is operating, so to speak, within reality. He's very explicit about that. That when he's talking about God, he's talking about a God who operates within reality, who is included in the totality of all things, rather than the source or ground or condition of all things. So I think it's fairly easy to show when you go to the to the Neoplatonic tradition in Plotinus and Proclus, that the one, so-called, is not anything, precisely as the ground of all things. That's why I put that quotation from Plotinus on the title page. The cause of all things is none of them. And the logic of that just should be absolutely and utterly obvious. And so many people seem to want their God to be something. But God can't be something, because any something, to be anything, is to be conditioned, and therefore to be not first, not unconditionally first. And you find the same thing in Aquinas when he says, for example, everything which in any way is from God. Obviously, then, his God is not included in everything which in any way is. So in opposition to what I like to call, and I do call in the paper, the objectification of the first principle. So there's this something up there, so to speak, which is the cause of all other things, and which we are trying to ascend to. Instead of that ascending to some supreme object, what we have rather is, as I put it, an ascent of the self. These ascending levels of selfhood, raising the self up to the level of being intellect, and then having necessarily to go beyond, hence my title, into the dark. The point being that anything whatsoever, anything that we have, that we think, that we know, anything at all, ipso facto, just as anything, is not God. We always have to go further. And that's why I refer at the end to what I call the difference between the God of theism, and who is a first being, a supreme object, something like that, and what I call the God of the mystics. And that's also what I have in mind with that. The third of those quotations on the title page, the quotation from Angela Silesius, I must pass beyond God into a desert. So that's what I'm trying to do in this paper. And let me just say one more thing, that an earlier version of it was directed explicitly and only really against Van Inwagen's paper. But for purposes of publication, I decided I didn't need to go making an influential enemy. So I made him into just one example of the wrong-headed thinking that I was talking about. But I hope that some of the, I guess parody is, no, that's not the right word, but some of the poking fun at this sheer silliness that you find if you look at that article of his has remained into the final version. So that's what I'm trying to do in this paper, and I can end my my initial remarks there.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Dr. Perl. So maybe to focus briefly on one of the other wrong-headed ways of asking the question that you discuss, specifically, so besides limiting it to concrete objects or the physical universe, another way of limiting it and thereby asking the question wrongly is by limiting it to contingent beings. So could you maybe go unpack that a little bit? Why is it that asking specifically why they're contingent beings, why is that a limiting of the question?
Well, because contingent beings are one, if there are such things. I'm always a little uncertain whether these categories of necessary contingent really work at all. But because you always have to ask contingent upon what. I prefer to say dependent rather than contingent, but be that as it may. Contingent beings, if that's a legitimate way of a mode of discourse at all, are one sort of beings. And they're distinguished from what are supposed to be necessary beings, or a necessary being, if there is such a thing. But that's, once again, as I said in the paper, that itself is a distinction within being. So that that fails to address the question, why is there being? As I said, even if there's a necessary being, if that notion makes sense at all, which I'm very dubious about. But even if there were, it would be included in being. And we would still have to ask, why is there this necessary being? As I said, necessary is in such a construction, necessary is a determination of being. And you can always eliminate from consideration a necessary being, not by thinking it and then denying that it exists. That would be self-contradictory. What it means to say it's necessary is that it includes that it exists in its being what it is, but simply by not thinking it, by not thinking, and therefore you're still a necessary being, even if that makes sense, and even if you could show that there is one, would still not answer the question: why is there being? Why is there anything at all? Or to put it another way, as I also talk about it in, I guess it's in part 2 of the paper, all of these categories, necessity, contingency, possibility, impossibility, etc., operate within thought. They are the categories in terms to say necessary means it's contradictory, it's self-contradictory to deny it, something like that. To say impossible is to say contradictory, and so on. But that leaves us with the question: why thought? Why is there thought? As I put it in one, I think is one of the most important lines in the paper, when what we are questioning is intelligibility itself, which is what's really going on when we ask, why is there being? All of those categories immediately get set aside because we are asking even why those categories? Why possibility and impossibility? Why logic? And that's why I ended part 2 of the paper in the way that I did, that the alternative to being, let me elaborate a little bit on that. The alternative to being is not, there is nothing. That's obviously nonsense. That doesn't make any sense. Nor is it thinking, which would be thinking nothing, which doesn't make any sense. That takes us right back to Parmenides. Doesn't, that can't happen. That doesn't make any sense. The alternative to being is, and I'm trying to suggest that this erasure, not so that you're not left with thinking, but thinking that there isn't anything. No, it's this just erasure of thinking. And if we fail to see that, then, as I say, we're failing to see what the question is asking. And it's striking. We can take it back to Van Inwagen and all these people. He's operating within thinking. That's one of the reasons why, as I say, analytic philosophy, it seems to me, cannot address the question, because it only operates within the categories of thought, and therefore fails to question thought itself.
So that silence, it seems like you might say that God, or the first principle, transcends the principle of the excluded middle. Like, it seems like God either has to exist or not exist, but that
would be true. That's true of beings.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because I think Marcus. And by the way, if anyone else has a question, feel free to come in or let me know. But I think Marcus has a question next.
Yeah. First, I want to say thank you for meeting with us, Dr. Perl. I really enjoy reading your work. So my first question is, I guess, just a question to make sure I'm following the argument right. So when you argue that we have to include the necessary being, if there is one, in the scope of the question, you turn to logic. We're really questioning logic and thinking itself, as you just said. And your argument for the validity of this question is based partly on Parmenides' claim that to be is to be intelligible. So if I understand you right, we are in a way even questioning that principle, since that you could say is a fundamental logical metaphysical claim. Is that right? Am I connecting the dots?
I wouldn't say I'm questioning that principle. I'm taking that principle as true.
Or questioning why it's true, or something like that.
Well, not exactly. Taking that equation of being and intelligible, then the question then becomes, why is there that? Why is there being which is the intelligible? Only that way can you include absolutely everything in the question. See, anything that you propose is going to be included in what you're asking about. That's my point there. So it's not to put that principle into question as though maybe that principle isn't true, or something like that. No.
Yeah, that's
take that as given and ask why that. Why?
That's what I was getting at. Not that you're undermining your premise or something like that, but you're asking, why is Parmenides' principle correct? Something like that. In a way.
Not exactly. I would prefer to say that what I'm pushing to is the condition. I like to use that word, but we should realize it's a metaphor. It's just like all the others. The condition or conditions for intelligibility itself. And that condition cannot itself be intelligible, therefore cannot itself be. That's what I'm pushing toward. realizing that to be
Okay.
intelligible, which is to say to be, is to be conditioned. And therefore, as long as, but all that you see, all this is where I keep coming back to, all you can do, you're not going to arrive at something which is that condition, because that something would be something intelligible. It would be subject to the condition. So you just always have to be going further. That's what I mean by into the dark. Not to some destination point, because that would be a something again, but just always looking beyond what can be seen by thought, to the word "the" is problematic because that objectifies it again. But recognizing that whatever can be seen is conditioned, therefore is not first. That's why it's negative, right? It's apophatic in that very strong sense of whatever you've got, it's not first. So we always have to go further. That doesn't mean we're going to arrive at a first, because if we did, it would be conditioned. It wouldn't be first. That's what I refer to as the self-transcendence of intellect.
Okay. Can I ask another question? Unless somebody else.
Yeah, Marcus, you go, and then we'll move.
Sure. Okay, so Dr. Perl, what would you say in response to a characterization of God as a necessary being, that insofar as God is necessary, God explains himself? So I was reading Edward Vaser the other day, and this is how he describes or accounts for Leibniz's argument for God's existence in terms of a necessary being. And to be a necessary being is to explain itself. So it doesn't need to refer to anything else, but it is a being. So can you just give me your thoughts on that kind of a...
Two things immediately come to mind. One is that to notice the difference between Leibniz and, for example, Aquinas on that point, and where Aquinas is much more in the Neoplatonic tradition here, because his God is not causa sui. His God is uncaused, not cause of itself. And he argues, and I think he's right, that it doesn't make sense to talk about anything being a cause of itself, because it would have to be prior to itself, which doesn't make any sense. So we should very carefully distinguish between uncaused and self-caused. That's one thing. And then I think we can make that argument that self, for something to be the cause of itself, simply that's just incoherent against Leibniz. And or to explain itself, same thing. And the other thing I would say is that a God so conceived is still a being, and as such is determinate, is something, is intelligible, is conditioned, therefore is included in reality, and therefore is not the principle of reality.
So you would deny this distinction between being a cause of itself as opposed to explaining itself. Of course, it can't be a cause of itself. Nothing can be a cause of itself. But
I would take the word cause more in the classic sense, where it covers, where aitia in Greek, covers any kind of explanatory factor, not just the. I'm not even sure if efficient causes, right? I mean, this is another problem. Is people talk about causality? Nowadays they seem only to be thinking about the crudest sort of billiard ball causality. I've been thinking about this a lot lately in connection with this notion of abstract objects, which are supposed to be not able to be causes, but the sense in which causality is being denied here seems to be that very narrow physical sort of sense. Whereas if we understand cause more broadly to mean any sort of explanatory factor, I would still say that nothing can explain itself, because the explanans has to be prior to the explanandum, logically prior at a minimum. And that's what I'm really going at here. It's logical priority.
Okay, thank you.
Great. I think Carson, did you have a question next? Or?
Yeah, I hope my Zoom is going to work because it's through my browser. But I had a question about the unconditioned and conditioned and why that was different from necessary, et cetera. I think you sort of addressed it. The second question I had was this idea of what a cause is seems important to your argument. We need to know that a cause is beyond what it causes to make the argument work.
Let me just mention that that's actually the first half of that I didn't include of that quotation from Plotinus that's on my title page. The actual in full, the sentence is, the cause is not the same as the caused, and the cause of all things is none of them. So that's exactly right. Yeah.
And we can get that principle without having to ascend to the one first.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch what you're asking exactly.
We can understand that principle from beings.
Yeah. Yes, and that's one of the nice things that Proclus does is he chases this all the way up all of these levels. The cause of you have the Aristotelian move. The cause of motion must itself not be in motion, must be unmoved. The cause of bodies must not be a body, must be incorporeal. Yeah, and so on. At every level, you have this transcendence where the cause transcends, is not included in that which is caused. And the difficulty really only begins, or gets really interesting, when you apply that to all things. Really, that's what it all depends on, right? This notion, it's when we discover, not that some things are caused, and that that whatever causes them must not be included in them, in that sense must transcend them. The trouble begins when and if we realize that all things are caused, that to be is to be caused. And then that's when we have to do what Proclus says, we have to take away all things from the cause of all things. The big question, it seems to me, is just that. Is it true that all things, without exception, the way I was describing at the outset, absolutely no exception of any kind whatsoever, all being, therefore, is caused? And that's what all three of these people, Proclus, Plotinus, and Proclus and Aquinas, are arguing, that is the case.
I was wondering if, because we get the idea of a cause from beings, that it sort of wouldn't apply when you go to something that's not a being. But I'm fine with your answer. I have one more kind of broad question, which is basically, what are the steps? How many steps are there to the final erasure, the self-annihilation, the fear and trembling? Because it seems like you end in a mood. There's a mood of fear and panic you talk about that Plotinus refers to. There's a mood of worship when you refer to Marathon and the angels. There seems to be a mood of even union with the one. And that mood seems to be not immediately after the indirect argument that you start with from Plotinus, which is that everything is some kind of unity. Therefore, the cause of all things has to be the one. Well, that's a kind of cataphatic statement. And after that argument, you sort of have to say, wait. We can't apply the term the one.
Right.
We have to, and seems like another step, like almost like another argument that gets you maybe even further to a third.
Yes, in a way. Yes, in a way, that's a further step, because the last step. Well, I'm reluctant to say this because I prefer to think more in kind of fractal or calculus sort of terms, as approaching a limit, something like that, but not actually getting to an endpoint. So I'm inclined to say there are, as I say, sort of to think in fractal terms. There can always be more steps because you can always subdivide, further. But in some sense, that's certainly what Plotinus and I think Proclus too, and actually Aquinas are saying, is that the last. Let's stick with Plotinus and Proclus first. The last step is to take away even one, to the extent that that is still a thought, that there's still some definite positive, no, I won't say definite here, but some positive meaning content in the expressed by the term one, take away that.
And that's another step.
It is in a certain sense. And that's why, Proclus goes, I don't think the logic of the situation is really different, but he expresses himself differently from Plotinus here by saying that the one which is the cause of beings is not, well, one itself. But again, that doesn't, you have to take away that too, why? Because in thinking it as the one which is the cause of beings, you're still thinking it as an it, as a something, as some definite content there. Take that away. And you're not going, as long as you still say that, well, that you're still left with anything, you haven't finished. Now, you get that in Plotinus, you get that in Proclus. That's what's going on in Aquinas, in the passage that Sam, you referred to in your email the other day, where he says you get to essay, to be, as to my mind, that corresponds to, for the Neoplatonist, is one, the condition in virtue of which beings are beings. You get to that as the what Aquinas puts it, the act of acts and the perfection of perfections. And then he says you have to take away even that. And so move into the darkness of unknowing.
I'm wondering if this just take away, it sounds very sort of, I don't know the word, just sort of, it doesn't sound like a mood to me. It sounds like, well, you got to take everything away. I'm reminded of Augustine in Book 7 of the Confessions, and sort of not being able to maintain his meditation, his ascent.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like you can tell people to just take everything away, and that's kind of fairly intelligible. Like, okay, you got to take everything away. But can you really have that mood of worship or fear and trembling or whatever that it seems like you're pointing to that really affects this erasure or self-annihilation? Because just telling someone, well, you got to take away even the predicate, the one. I mean, it seems like, okay, then I'll just understand that the one is beyond even the one. But am I at the end of the process then? Do I have the proper mood, or is you don't really need a mood and the fear and trembling stuff is just kind of rhetoric?
Yeah,
and
well,
I'll let someone else.
I'm a little torn about this use of the word mood. On the one hand, I kind of like what you're getting at, as opposed to there's this object that you get to. On the other hand, it sounds much too subjective to me. I'm not sure if that's what you mean necessarily, but that's something that I hear when I hear the word mood.
Use fear and trembling. I mean, as the words
it's always it's fearful because thought demands being. It's to speak in a Heideggerian mode. Thought is at home with being. That's where it belongs together. Thought, thinking, and being always together, and therefore it is unheimlich to look beyond being. That's why Plotinus says that the soul is afraid that it will have nothing. So yes, there is this to be told. I mean, it's all very well to say take away everything. Yeah, okay, we can see the logic of that. Yeah. Wait a minute. Shouldn't that be seen as scary? To take away everything. And I should add that surely it's got to be not simply a once for all. Okay, take away everything. Been there, done that, got it. But an ongoing effort of taking away. Precisely because as long as there is thinking, as long as there is being, as long as there is self, Plotinus says, the soul has to unknow even itself. You get that in Dionysius too. You're not there. So I think it might be better to speak of it as an ongoing effort rather than as either a once for all achievement or as a mood.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I keep on, as I'm hearing you discuss this, your paper takes us to the edge of thought, the edge of intellect. And I recall another paper you wrote, The Good of the Intellect, where you discussed the intellect's intuition. And perhaps two thoughts come to mind. I think part of the problem with the people who you are engaging in debate don't have the understanding of the intuition of the intellect, so they're totally limiting the framework of their approach to our rational capacity. And also, to me, when we are taken to the edge, I think that's where metaphysics, to put it in a sort of like provocative kind of way, metaphysics then enters into theurgy. And what I mean by that is that it enters into, if you are at the edge of thought, then inevitably you're aiming, like you're saying, in a continual effort to be identified with the one, with the first principle, in a way where you're transcending yourself and you are actually erotically, going back to your source, the procession and return. So what you're doing in the paper is sort of like reminding us that we're within this limited framework, and that we ultimately, for us to answer the question that you placed in the beginning, we have to revert back. But to revert back, it seems to me, it necessitates the impartation of the one to us, a certain level of grace that will somehow trigger our intuitive capacity to be able to transcend our own limitations, our own noetic limitations. So then you enter in, which is, I think, what is being referred to as mood and trembling, the tearing asunder of like the intellect, it enters into the realm of ascesis, the prayer, and also like what Saint Dionysius refers to in the ecclesiastical and heavenly hierarchy, like the theurgy that we ultimately are engaged in. I mean, so philosophy, the metaphysical process that you describe, referring to Proclus and Plotinus, is in a way is a parallel path to what should already be taking place, which Plotinus would also be he would be thinking in a similar way in terms of going inward. So because you ascend by going inward, by shedding any of the sense impressions, the forms, the sensible kind of impressions that prevent you from that taken away,
or even any intelligible content.
Yeah, exactly.
Multiple steps, as he says there.
And so the interesting thing is that when you read the Philokalia, when you really look at it, it's like it's that theurgic component that like is presupposed in a way by Plotinus. It's like you are meditating, you're going inside in order to divorce yourself from the intelligible and to enter into that nothingness, which is union with the one.
Yeah, a lot depends on what we mean by the terms, the two of the key terms you used, grace and theurgy. It sounds like by theurgy, it sounds to me like you're not referring to physical material rituals, which is often what's meant in this context. Now, I'm not saying that there's no place for those, but I don't think that's what you're talking about.
I'm including that, but as only one part of like a totality, because like prayer, because I'm thinking theurgy in terms the way the Saint Dionysius would put it, or Pseudo Dionysius, as the sacred rites, the partaking of the symbols, because the symbols actually enable you to ascend.
Yes, and
from
that brings
sensible to intelligible.
Yeah, and that brings me to what I wanted to say about what you said about grace, which is there again, a lot depends what you mean by it. If it's meant as something specially granted to some people, not to others, as something arbitrary, something like that. I'm thinking, Henri Dumery says that only somebody to whom the word grace connotes arbitrariness could deny that there's grace in Plotinus. But as long as that's not what's meant by it, then I think we're okay, because one of the, I should say, implications and or presuppositions of that I didn't bring out very really in the paper, or at least only very, very implicitly, is that what I was referring to is the condition of thinking and being must be present, must always already be present. It's that we're not paying attention to it because we're always focusing our thought not on beings, on things that are, things that can be apprehended, whether at the sensible or even at the intellectual level, and not attending to what is not anything, but the condition in virtue of which there is thought and there are things. But that condition, as you say, that's got to be there, so to speak, from the first. That's what Plotinus is getting at, or one of the things he's getting at in his metaphor of light, that there's always light whenever there's seeing going on, but we pay attention to the visible things rather than to the light by which they are visible. And what we need to do is not turn to some other thing, but rather attend to the condition, the always already present condition by which those things are visible. And to do that, once again, that's to take away all things, because then you're not seeing any of the things, you're attending to light itself, which is not to see anything. So in that sense of grace, it's always already present, and only because it's always already present, we can turn to it. I think that sounds exactly right. And Plotinus, after all, does say that in our ascent, we are lifted by the giver of our love. Again, unless grace has to mean something arbitrary, surely that's grace. But it's present to all of us, because it's the very condition of thinking and being, but we don't attend to that condition. The quotations I had from Rainer Schurman, I think, in the footnotes, speak to that point. That's also why I included those quotations from Plotinus that are religious in nature, where he uses the metaphor, or perhaps more than a metaphor, of preparing oneself for a religious ritual by fasting. And he says, if you don't do that, then you're going to miss out on the God. So that religious, or I don't know what the devotional perhaps dimension is emphatically present in Plotinus. Proclus, you have to wonder, he says it, but you have to wonder, does he really know and mean what he says, or is he paying lip service to it? Aquinas, I think the discourses are different, because it's certainly there, but I think he keeps these things in separate works. So if you look at his devotional works, his hymns, those famous things he said to his friend, I don't remember his name, toward the end of his life and so on, you can see it's there, and it's been there all along. That's what Marymount is getting at, right, in that quotation. But Aquinas doesn't talk about it when he's doing his scholastic philosophy and theology. In Plotinus, one of the great things I think about Plotinus is that you don't have that kind of separation. It's always all there together. The dialectical metaphysics and the devotion are never separate or separable, even in the mode of discourse that's getting used. Let me just say one more thing, that the expression union or unification with the one is problematic because once it suggests an object there. Right. But to express it something more like, I don't know, self-identification, that this transcending right. of the self, right? So not finding an object there, but the divine, call it what you will, as the inmost depth within the self, to which we can work. Yes, I think obviously, identifying oneself with the one is one way of expressing that. Or union, again, is a way of expressing it. But union, again, as I've heard the expression used, and I like it, a union which is not a union with, because union with implies some other being, and that's not going to work.
Dr. Perl, this is Daniel. I got a couple of questions. So I wanted to it seems like there's a lot of material here that's also in theophany, about where you talk about the identification of being and thought, and how being is definite and determinate. So would it be safe to say that being is connascent with determination? But you also seem to imply in here that it's prior to determination. So.
No, I would not say prior to determination. I would connascent is one way of putting it. Yeah, because being is intelligible, and to be intelligible is to be determinate. Therefore, to be is to be determinate. That's something that's at work throughout. It's very, very explicit, above all in Plotinus. It's in Proclus too, but Plotinus really says that so many places so nicely, that a being is a something, a T, in Greek. And when he says that, when he explains that the one is beyond being and all of that, one of his favorite ways of saying that is uti, which you could variously translate not something, not a something, not anything, not a what, and it means all of those things, and all of that carries that sense of determinacy. I don't think that it gets more fundamental than that.
Right. So if we build on that, and you kind of brought this up in your last point about Plotinus and Aquinas, and I guess I see some discontinuity between those two thinkers, in the sense that Aquinas ends with at the final top of the head here with being itself.
There, I would disagree.
Okay.
Because and that's largely, almost entirely, a product of translation. He ends with essay. Actually, that's not even true, because you have to take away even that. But in the sense in which the Neoplatonists ends with one, Aquinas ends with essay. But essay is not being; it is to be. Right? It's an infinitive verb, not a gerund. Not a noun, not a thing which is. And there's been so much for centuries. It drives me crazy because there's no excuse for it. It's just bad translation.
Yeah.
For centuries, the issue has been obscured by people translating both ens from the Latin, ens, and essay as being.
Okay.
And you can't. Once you do that, you can't straighten it out anymore.
Right.
I've read works where in same problem to a certain extent in French, where they could avoid it because the French philosophers have coined the non-existent word étant to mean ens, right, a being, to distinguish it from être. But the problem is that in ordinary everyday French, the word être means both to be and a being. Same confusion. And I've read works where you can go on for pages and not be able to figure out what is he talking about when he's talking about être in French. Is he talking about ens, or is he talking about essay? And never stating, never explaining, never clarifying.
Yeah. So in theophany, you seem to imply that Aquinas' conception of God was this self-contained entity.
No, I'm trying not to imply that.
Okay.
By insisting that we should not, that if we translate ens as being, then we should not use the word being to translate esse when referring to God.
Okay.
Right. That's why I've experimented with various ways around this. As you may know, in my book Thinking Being, I translated esse as existence, following people like Gilson. I'm not sure whether that was such a great idea. I have experimented with not translating it at all, which sort of sidesteps the problem. I'm inclined to translate it literally as to be, with all of the awkwardness that comports. God is to be itself, subsisting by itself. God is just to be, right? Esse tantum. That's if you translate it that way, that seems to me that becomes a very powerful statement, because if God is just to be, that makes it very clear that God is not a thing which is, and then
not even an object of thought,
right?
Either.
Yeah, I mean, what would that even mean? To think to be? No, you can only think of something, a being, right? Being, ens, not esse. That's very important. Ens, being, falls first in the conception of intellect. So if God is esse, then God does not fall in the conception of intellect.
So there would be congruity here between, though he's using different terms.
Exactly. That's exactly how I see it.
Okay, so you do see there's actually congruency here between he and Plotinus.
Yes. And I think that has been obscured by the terminological difference, which in turn is further obscured by the translation problem.
Right.
If you looked at my article, Lessons by Addition, I went on for about, 5 pages or so about the translation problem and how that just completely muddles the issue by translating both ens and esse by the same English word, or same problem if you do with the same French word or the same German word.
Okay. And my next question is that you on page, I think it's on page 196, where you describe the metaphor of light, and that light is the condition by which things become intelligible. Do you think? Do you see some congruency here between what you and maybe Dr. Butler would be saying about the one as the principle of individuation? It's radically negative, but it's this principle by which we adjudicate something as one. One thing.
On the whole, yes. I'm not sure that. There's some issues in which I would disagree with him, but basically, yes. Especially where I would agree with Ed Butler is getting away from this notion of this hypostatized the one.
The reification of it.
Exactly, which just isn't what's going on very plainly in Proclus, and I would argue even in Plotinus, although there's more room for, I think there's more room for dispute about the issue there. But in Proclus, what is he saying? He's not saying there is this thing named the one, which is the cause of all things. What he's saying is one is what lets anything be a thing. The character, so to speak. Right. One. Just one.
So if we get rid of everything, all of the things about the one, are we just left with the divine henads then? Is that the case? Or the Trinity, or whatever?
No, well, the henads are the participated ones, one as a character of this or that being. And therefore, each henad is limited to the being or beings that participate it. And that's what renders it indirectly accessible, so to speak. But one of the things, this is one of the places where I don't entirely agree with Edward, is that one of the implications of that is that each and every henad isn't, Proclus is so clear about this, isn't just one. It's a participated one. It's the one of this or that. it's not just one. And so we can't stop with the henads. Now, where I agree with him is saying that doesn't mean we go beyond the henads to something, which would be another thing, another being, or another henad or something. No, but we can't just stop with the henads, because each and every henad, precisely in that it is participated, it belongs to these or those beings, therefore is not just one, is not the unconditioned first.
So here's a tough question about that then. So if the henads are considered super essential, okay, in Proclus, which you'd agree with, correct?
Yes, as long as we carefully explain what we mean by that. But
they're beyond being,
in the sense that they are the principles by which beings exist. Yes.
Right. So if I understand with my intellect that they are distinct, however that comes to me, by either text or the conceptions that I'm grasping about them, or theophany. Okay.
I think it's going to be more along the lines of what Father Silouan.
How would they not be
meditation and attaining that level? There's much more to it. Anyway, but go on.
How are they, instead of them being at the level of the one, how are they not at the level of being? If I grasp their intelligibility, that they are distinct, that this henad is not that henad, in other words.
Yeah, but what distinguishes them from each other is the beings that they participate. Here again, I think I would just disagree with Edward Butler on this point. But it seems to me Proclus is very explicit about that it's just in being participated by different beings that each henad is the henad that it is distinct from other henads. That's why Proclus says that although they are, strictly speaking, the henads are unknowable because they're not beings, they are, so to speak, indirectly knowable through the beings that participate them. Whereas, therefore, only the first, because unparticipated, is absolutely unknowable, which I always take to mean just disappears altogether. You always have to be going further, because whatever you've got, it's not the first.
Right.
Great. Thanks, Daniel,
Thank you
for those questions. Maybe before we go to Alex, Dr. Halper, if you wanted to just, did you have a question perhaps? Or?
Yeah. Hello. Thank you for the paper. When Avicenna and Aquinas raise a question about why there's something rather than nothing, it's followed up by an account of being. And when
but can I ask you right there, what do you mean by being? And I don't know what Arabic terms Avicenna is using, but what Latin terms are we referring to in connection with Aquinas?
Well, as you've been using the term yourself, essay is the term.
No, but see, I'm using being to translate ens, not essay.
Right. So there's an account of an ens, what makes an ens an ens. In Aquinas, it's developed quite nicely, and it's certainly an improvement in addition to what we have in Avicenna, where there isn't. It's just being is, as Aquinas likes to say, superadded to essence. Whereas in Aquinas, the being character, the ens, what makes it an ens, is something that's different from the essential nature of the. So this is really a key move in medieval philosophy. This account of being that comes after raising this question, whereas in the Neoplatonists, you don't really have an account of being. You have something like why is there something rather than nothing, and it's you get the first steps in Plotinus. There's sort of enigmatic claims about the one looking at itself and thereby becoming nous or something like that. It's some sort of a metaphor, obviously, but you get the first step, but you really don't get the whole thing unfolding from this first principle. From the first, you get the first step, and then the next step, and then the next step. So my question to you is, what's the difference? What are the significant differences between somebody like Aquinas and Avicenna, who raised this question, why is there something rather than nothing? And follow it up by an account of being. And somebody like Plotinus, Proclus, or any of the Neoplatonists, who seem to be dealing with something of the same question, and give an account of how the one emanates to lesser hypotheses. However, they don't actually give an account of being.
My first step would be to drastically disagree with that reading of Plotinus. First of all, gosh, in so many ways. First of all, I think it's a misreading of the passage in question to say that the one turns to itself or something like that. What he's talking about, his pronouns are vague, admittedly, but if you look at the whole context and this works in general and so on, I would argue, and there are lots of other people too, who would argue that what he's saying is the intellect turns to the one, not that the one turns to itself.
There's
secondly,
no intellect. But the question is, where does the intellect come from? How do we get an intellect?
Okay. Secondly, you can never, in Plotinus or in any of these people, you can never do that kind of top-down move, as though you start with the one and then explain how the one generates or intellect. Emanation. First of all, emanation is a metaphor. What is it a metaphor for? Dependence, or as I've been putting it, I prefer even better to say conditionedness, being conditioned. To say that all things emanate from the one, that doesn't explain anything. It isn't a metaphysical theory. It isn't a metaphysical doctrine. It is absolutely nothing but a metaphor for the dependence of all things on one. Not one thing, not the one as a first object, but the dependence of all things on one as the condition in virtue of which they exist. There isn't any other emanation going on here. That's just what emanation is. If we understand that, then the parallel with Aquinas becomes very, very precise, because Aquinas explains that creation is nothing but, for which he also uses the metaphor of emanation, by the way, is nothing but the dependence of all beings on esse in order to exist. So, I'm not sure what to say, except that bracketing Avicenna, whom I don't know well enough to be able really to talk about, I would disagree with almost everything that you said, both about Plotinus himself and about the supposed difference between Plotinus and Aquinas here. They're talking about the conditioned nature of beings as such, beings qua beings.
Well, and I wasn't taking myself to saying anything. I was asking a question.
Yeah. Okay.
The question is, what is the difference? What happens when somebody like Aquinas is asking the question of why is there something rather than nothing in order to give an account of being, as opposed to Plotinus and Proclus and other Neoplatonists who deal with some question that seems to be along those lines. They're positing a one, an unconditioned one, as you pointed out very nicely, in order to deal with why there's anything else at all. But they don't pose the problem as a problem of being, and they don't give an account of being.
There I would disagree. I think they do. Plotinus, both Plotinus and Proclus are very clear that we, in our thought, we get to the level of being, that is the intelligible, and discover that being is conditioned and as such is not first.
So when Aquinas talks about the being that belongs to a particular thing,
now we're talking about, now it's a different word. Now we're talking about esse, not ens.
Well, it's they have the ends has a kind of essay to it.
Right, exactly.
It has a being, and that
no,
being
it has an existence or it has an essay. It is a being. Got to really get the terminology precise here, or we're going to get confused.
We may disagree with this about this along with everything else, but the idea is that there's an essence that things have, and that essence could be something that's potential or it could be actual. And it's actual when it is in an existing thing. It's the ends is an ends because there is some sort of an activity there. Okay, and
yes.
that account that's a very interesting and a very innovative an account of being. And when Plotinus is interested in why it is that there are things, when we point to the one, it's unconditional one, and there's some sort of an emanation, as you said, it's not clear what it is. It's something of a metaphor, and somehow it produces intellect.
Which is only to say that intellect, which is being, depends on one.
Right, but that's the problem. That's what I'm really what I'm raising about. The problem that I'm trying to raise a question about. That you don't really have an account of the being that belongs to nous, of the sort that you get in Aquinas. And
I don't see the difference that you're
don't
pointing
have
to or asking about.
Of any kind of actuality that belongs to being that makes a being be.
You do.
You get an account.
The name of the improper name of the actuality that makes being is one. And in fact, he expressly in Treatise 6a says that only that is pure actuality. Being on it involves potentiality, just like in Aquinas, because it is actuated by one. So for Plotinus, intellect, which is being, is not pure actuality. That's one of the places where he differs from Aristotle. Intellect, which is being, is not pure actuality. It's an actualized potency. And therefore, we have to look beyond on, which is intellect, which is on, to the first, which is pure actuality, which therefore is not being. The name he gives it is one. The name Aquinas gives it is essay. But what I'm arguing is that they're really, so to speak, seeing the same thing about being. That being is conditioned being, which is another way of saying that being is an actualized potentiality, not pure actuality.
So just to understand, you're saying there's actually is no difference between Aquinas' account of being and Plotinus's account.
On that particular point, I do not think there is a difference except terminologically.
And therefore that Aquinas hasn't really made that contribution to metaphysics that
right, that's right. I would see Aquinas, right. I would see, I'm one of those who sees Aquinas not as a innovator, but as one of the last great representatives of a long tradition in which he is in continuity with Plotinus, Proclus, Dionysius, I don't know how many, what other, some of it comes via Boethius, but that there's a continuity there rather than a Thomistic innovation. Yeah.
So I'm not going to, I don't want to pursue this any further. I think we just disagree about this. But on the other hand, I just want to mention that Avicenna understands Plotinus in the way that I was suggesting. So there's a long tradition of reading Plotinus in this way as an emanation, as some sort of an account of the one coming into some sort of self-relation, and that gives rise to nous, the second hypothesis, and this is not only present in Avicenna but in many other people from the Arabic tradition whom Aquinas was drawing upon. So I don't want to. I don't want to push you. I mean, it's clear we just agree about this, but thank you very much. And I have to apologize. I have to leave after.
Let me just mention that I do know enough about Avicenna to know this, that the kind of, I think it's fair to say, Gilsonian treatment of Avicenna that you're adopting here is no longer, at any rate, completely unquestioned. And that, for example, John McGinnis, who's one of the leading Avicenna scholars today, has argued that that isn't actually a fair reading of Avicenna. So again, I'm not in any position to adjudicate that debate, but I just wanted to say that there are people who read Avicenna quite differently from the way that I think you're sort of taking for granted.
I'm reading Avicenna, so I'm
okay. Then you're better. Then you're more to talk about than I am.
Yeah, I encourage you to read Avicenna. It's really quite interesting in light of the issues that you've been addressing here. I have to say thank you, and I have to leave at this point. So bye bye.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Dr. Halper, for those questions. I think next in line was Alex. Alex, do you still have a question, or?
Yeah.
Okay,
no,
awesome.
Thanks, Dr. Perl. I appreciate you answering our questions and kind of walking us through some of the arguments you have here. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, great. So this is a question I had both by your article and about, it came up when I was reading Theophany. I recently read that and thought it was great. So you described also in the answering questions here, that God is not something that is. There's kind of this emphasis on God being beyond being. But also in some sense, God is the cause of all that is, or the condition of all that is. So how is it that something that is not be a cause or be a condition?
I would just turn the question, or perhaps if even an objection, on its head and say it should be clear that the cause, or probably clearer to say condition of being, cannot be a being. That's exactly what Plotinus does. He says it's because the one is not anything that it's the cause of all things. Why? Because if it were included in all things, if it were something, it would be included in all things. It wouldn't be the cause of all things. So cause in such a context includes in itself, or indeed is an expression of, negation. That the whole point is that, once again, the cause is different from the caused, right? The cause of anything, or of any class of things, can't be included in among those things. It's the cause of them. Therefore, it follows that if there is a cause of all things, that's the point that needs argument. But if there is a cause of all things, it cannot be included in all things. And that's the thought that sends thought spinning into the abyss. To use Maritain word there, as I put it, into the dark. So what we have to see, it's really quite striking how Plotinus kind of recognizes the point that you're raising and turns it back on itself to say it's exactly the reverse. If the one were something, then it could not be the cause of everything, because it would be included in that totality that we name everything. Since what we mean, or perhaps I might better say what we point to by the one, so-called, is the cause or the condition of absolutely all things with no exception whatsoever, therefore, it must not be included in that totality, absolutely all things whatsoever. And that's what he means by beyond being. He said, one of the many places where he says, I was referring to the beginning of Ennead 5.2, where he says it's because it is no thing, it's able to be the cause of all things. There's also a very similar passage in 5.1, And there's also the passage, Sam, you mentioned this again in your email. It's one of the passages from Plotinus that I quoted in the paper, but it's only one of many that I could have cited to this effect. I find it one of the clearest ones. That's why I like to quote it, where he really works this out very, very carefully. Let me see. Yeah, that's the one. Let's start several lines into it. A reality must be some this, that is something determinate. But that, that's one of his ways of favorite ways of referring to one. If you actually read Plotinus in the Greek, he uses the expression the one much, much less often than comes across in translation. Very frequently, he just uses this pronoun, ekenos, which I has translated as that, which has this sense of sort of pointing in a direction rather than naming a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But they says that ekenos is not understood as a this, for then it would not be the principle, but only that this which you said it was. See, if it's one of the beings, it's not the principle of beings. If therefore all things are in what is generated, that's the point here, recognizing that all things are generated in the sense that they are conditioned or dependent. Which of the things will you say in it are you say that it is? Since it's none of these, it can only be said to be beyond these. And then he makes it very clear that that word beyond does not indicate, oh, there's something else out there, but it's purely negative in meaning. It just means not one of the things. He says, since it's none of these, he can only say beyond these, but these are the beings. And being, meaning taken as a totality, they are being. They are that which is altogether. Therefore, beyond being. This beyond being does not mean a this. It does not affirm and does not say its name, but it conveys only not this. Or that last phrase might actually be translated not a this. Right? In Greek doesn't have an indefinite article, so you could translate that either way. Not a this. And that's all that it means to say beyond being. Not any of the beings. Why? Because all beings are conditioned. Therefore, any being is not itself the first.
Mm-hmm.
In another paper I wrote many, many years ago, one of my earliest papers, I was sort of engaging with Derrida to some extent, and I played with using this expression that being is second without a first, which I still think captures something. What we recognize, the most we can recognize, is that being is second. Whatever we've got, it's not first. And that, again, is the reason for my title, Into the Dark, right? Not to a first something, because whatever is a something isn't first. Into the dark. And again, I keep coming back to that quotation from Angela Silesius. I must pass beyond God into a desert. Always beyond, because whatever you've got, it isn't where you're going. It isn't first. It isn't supreme. Just by the very fact that you've got it, which means that it's a something. It's not the absolute. Perhaps a less provocative way of putting it that I used in another article, which I suspect I would like to try this one out on Dr. Halper. I know he left, because it's something that I think I would expect that even the most committed Thomist, traditional-minded Thomist, not my kind of Thomist, would agree with, which is simply to say this: any thought we may have of God falls infinitely short of God himself. Is that objectionable? I'm trying to formulate it in a way that might be less objectionable, or to some, a certain kind of minds, less problematic. But surely, would there really be any serious disagreement with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, like to paraphrase Aristotle, we should be friends with the Thomists, we should be closer friends with the truth. But yeah, the thing that I'm still kind of hung up on is that it seems like, though, being is just that which is, right? And it seems like there's an immediate jump of being referred to primarily as conditioned being, now this concept, the second without a first, or the very apophatic way of understanding God, of whatever you can think about it is going to fall infinitely short. But there's still, it seems like it's trying to point, it's a finger pointing at the moon, but not the moon itself, where it's like it's trying to point towards, but it's pointing towards something that is, it seems like something that is not a nothing. It's
well,
not
my point is that something that is necessarily conditioned.
Okay, so you would say, so your definition of is necessarily conditioned. So would like an unconditioned is just be like a non-category?
Basically, yes, unless you mean by that, and this is a very very unusual, very strange use of language. Mm-hmm. An unconditioned is not meaning an unconditioned thing which is, but rather just is. Without the thing. Mm-hmm. Not the thing which is, just is. Well, that seems to me, first of all, is there anything to think there? I would say no. And that seems to come very close to some of the things that Aquinas says. There's a line from in Anthony Kenny's book, Aquinas on Being, which if you haven't read it and you ever feel you need a laugh, go read it, because it's so bad that it's hilarious. But it includes this line where he says, my being is human being. Fido's being is canine being. God's being is just being. And he continues, God isn't anything of any kind. He just is. And you read to there and say, oh, he's got it. And then his next sentence is, but this is surely nonsense. And just dismisses that. He almost got there. He almost saw it. And then he just refuses to see it. So if that's what you mean by is, I suppose it wouldn't be my chosen way, but I think it's a way of expressing what we're getting at here. But then we really have to realize that just is, without any thing which is exercising that actus essendi, that act of being, anything that's exercising that is, leaves you with no content. Once again, just as for the Neoplatonists, one, without anything which is one, which has the character one, leaves you with nothing to think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Alex. And I think Michael next. Thanks for being patient. Appreciate it.
Hey, Eric. Thanks for the paper. I very much enjoyed it. And I guess I've got 3 different questions. And so the first one, I agree with everything you're doing. And so this first one is sort of to see if, kind of taking your paper as a starting point, like to go further, whether you think this is a good way to go. So it seems to me that there might actually be a difference between the question, why is there anything at all? And then the other question, why is there something rather than nothing? Because it doesn't seem to me that when I ask a why question in like the broad sense of looking for a cause, like the Neoplatonists are talking about, that it doesn't seem like I have to have like an alternative in mind. Like when Socrates asks, why is this something carried? The answer is because it's being carried. Or why is this something loved? Because it's being loved. It doesn't seem to me that I don't need to be thinking of, well, wait, what if it wasn't carried? What would it be, right? And so it doesn't seem to me like I need, when I'm asking why is there something or why is there anything at all, I don't see I just don't see that as the same thing exactly as asking why is there something rather than nothing. And I guess as a side point, the people who were saying or arguing that this question is meaningless, it seems to me they only have a case at all in the case of the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Because they're just claiming like nothing is meaningless, right? And that's why the whole question fails. But if I'm asking why is there anything at all, I haven't made any reference to nothing. And so I don't see like why that should be deemed meaningless, even from their point of view, other than it's a question that doesn't have an answer, which, but that isn't really like, that doesn't mean it's meaningless. It just means it doesn't have like a answer that you could give. So
although there are people who say that a question that can't be answered is there are some people who say that a question that can't be answered is meaningless. I would disagree, but there are people who say that. I'm not sure what you're getting. I would say this, though, if you say why is there something rather than nothing, the appendage rather than nothing is unnecessary and serves only as a kind of an emphasis, as a kind of a reinforcement. It's not intended, at least as I understand it. Here's where maybe I'm differing from Heidegger, which is always something I'm okay with doing. It's not to suggest there is an alternative. There are two alternatives here, being or nothing, and we're asking why is this alternative the case rather than that one. That's not what I mean when I use the expression rather than nothing. I use it solely to reinforce the point that being is absolutely all comprehensive. I won't say there is nothing outside it or other than it, because that's is nothing. You can't say that. Right? There is not anything other than or outside of or additional to being. So I'm not sure that the rather than nothing part really makes a difference. Now, if we leave that out, is there a difference between asking why is there anything and why is there something? As long as we understand the word anything to mean not this, that, or the other thing, but isn't that why we use the expression anything at all, right? To be all comprehensive. Then is there a difference between those two questions?
Yeah, I guess not. If I mean, and this is kind of what I wanted to sort of see as I'm thinking through this is, yeah, I guess I was thinking of the question, why is there something rather than nothing, more along the Heidegger lines, where we are trying to sort of think an alternative, like think nothing.
Right, and I would agree with the people who say no, that's not, there is no alternative. I would disagree with their claim that therefore the question is meaningless.
Yeah, I guess because you're saying like rather than nothing isn't really, it's not like you're referring to something there, right? It's just just like a qualification, and so it doesn't like function.
Or as I say, really, it's just a kind of an underlining of the meaning of the word being. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, that helps because I was kind of again I'm sort of wondering because it comes up with Parmenides as well, who you talk about in the paper, where how are we to interpret the non-being in Parmenides also, and it seems like Heidegger and wants to take it where, hey, there's something actually there for us to think.
I guess so. I'm not sure, but I always have trouble, frankly, just understanding Heidegger. But that seems to be what he's doing, and if so, that's not what I'm doing. And something that none of us have mentioned yet is the first paragraph of part 3, I think it is, of my paper, where I refer to Parmenides and say, the question, it's not demanding an answer. Any answer would be a wrong answer. The question is expressing the astonishment that being is. In that sense, it is not so much a question in the sense of a question that's asking for an answer, but a pointing to something that needs to be recognized, that being is. And if we ask why, the answer is not going to be, well, there's something that brings it about that being is, because that would be a something, therefore included in being. But once again, recognizing that being is, and I guess we should then have to add, recognizing that being is conditioned, or it wouldn't be being, forces us to, how to say it, leave being behind, take away all things, however you want to put it, and move into that, as I put it in that sentence, that silencing of the mind.
If I could step in real quick, it sounds like the astonishment. Earlier, I was talking about the steps to the erasure, and it sounds like the astonishment and the mood is happening as soon as you recognize that being is.
It does. I mean, if you really take in, that's why I find Parmenides so exciting. In fact, I'm working on Parmenides at the moment, now in relation to Aristotle. I think there are two ways of responding to Parmenides, and one is, being is. Well, we all knew that, of course. So what? And the other is, oh my God, that's what that quotation from Proclus is. Oh my, there's being. There is. Just there is. That, that anything is. Isn't that the difference between the attitude I like that word better than mood. The attitude of worship and the attitude of well, non-worship. Okay, there's a world, so what? World in the broad sense, not merely of universe, but that's there are beings.
You say this leads to the silencing of the mind. I mean, is it as soon as you say, "Oh wow, there's beings," my mind's going silent now, or then you need another argument, which is not silencing of the mind. So you need that extra step to get to the silencing of the mind. And then whatever that argument is, it seems like there might even be a further step, which is like, well, we can't even use the predicate one. It doesn't seem like you've outlined the steps very clearly here. That's just a worry that I have.
Mm-hmm.
Where it seems like sometimes it seems like the silencing of the mind occurs just through one of these arguments, or maybe even here, which seems prior to it.
I can see, in a certain sense, going beyond being is. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should just stop there. The rest is not, I suppose, I haven't really thought about this, but I suppose it's not really working to a further conclusion or something like that. It's just trying to lay out the discursively what that moment of astonished silence just is.
Doesn't that come from the thought that you need a cause?
So excuse me for my dogs are barking, so I'm not going to be able to hear you. Just a moment. Go on.
I was going to ask him about.
Okay, sorry about that.
It seems like the astonishment might come from expecting there to be a cause, but what's the reason for the astonishment? It seems like something's unexpected with being. But is it because that, well, every other thing has a cause for its being, but being as such, where's the cause for that? And now I'm astonished because I can't really point to one. Is that the reason,
or is it simply just being? No, I shouldn't use that word. That's it. Getting hit in the eye, in the mind. By being. That itself, I'm inclined to suggest that if we are not, how does Coleridge put it? If our spirit is not fixed in awe and wonder, then we're not responding properly.
It sounds like this is non-determinate being, just it is itself.
But there's always the it, right, which is determinate. There's always this is, that is, the other is. There's something which is.
Proclus in the multi-level ontology paper, where you say the first cognition of man is just as being before the further differentiation. Would that be determinate as well?
Yes, very much so. For Proclus, being is, I think that's what he's working out when you get this whole elaborate, typically Procline, working out of being as a mixture of limit and unlimited. Well, that is to say that it's determinate. What does determinate mean if not having some determination, which implies that there's determination and there is that which is determined? And that's one of his ways of saying that being can't be first. It's, as I say, it's sort of in his typical, perhaps needless complexity. But I think that's where he's going. But certainly it is the case that for Proclus, even what he calls the one being is determinate. Okay. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the one being.
Okay. I want to let Jack come in here, but I was maybe wanting to give a response. I mean, it seems like you didn't fully articulate what is it about it is that brings us astonishment. Is it just the conditionedness of being, of all beings, that is?
Well, again, but that's after the, I hate to use this word, but I'll use it temporarily, the experience. That's after you're struck by being. You can think it through and find that it's conditioned. Therefore, you can do the philosophy. But this is sort of prior to that discursive philosophizing. It's being
prior to the fear, even at the end of the philosophizing.
Well, I think the fear is going to come right. I mean, awe is a kind of fear in a way. It's not fear of something, but it's a kind of.
You have a kind of fear before terror. You philosophize, and then you philosophize. So the rest, then you have fear again.
Yeah,
when you really need to self the mind. So that I'm saying.
What I'm saying, I guess, what I'm saying is that you can't, by way of arguing, philosophical argumentation, you can't ensure that the person you're talking to is going to have that experience. You can't bring it about by that kind of discourse. What you can do is try to articulate what's going on in that experience. But frankly, this is where I have trouble sympathizing with, and indeed successfully entering into dialogue, into conversation with people who don't share this wonder at being. It's got to start there, and I think that's where Parmenides starts. Perhaps that's where Parmenides ends. At least Parmenides, instead of going on for pages or books, the way Plato or Aristotle or Plotinus or Aquinas does, but you could argue that his 50 lines of fragment 8 of Parmenides is 49 lines too much, But really, what does the goddess say? She just keeps going on. She just keeps repeating, being is, being is, being is. There's nothing else to say. Should she go on for 50 lines saying it? Well, that's a question of emphasis again, I suppose. But if you really look through what is said in those lines, nothing else comes out. She just keeps repeating. That's why it's changeless. That's why it's undifferentiated. Why? Because it is. That's all. That's the only thing that you can say.
So I wonder if that's superior to Plotinus and Aquinas, who recognize Coleridge's awareness too. But I want to let Jack go because he's had his hand raised. So
yeah. Let's Jack, please. Thanks for being patient, Jack.
Okay, I was going to ask about some stuff that you had to say about Aquinas. So, what's going on with his notion of creation ex nihilo being an act of the will there? Because the first response when I've deployed this to Thomists you're reading is well, creation has to have some sort of act of the will, so it can't possibly just mean dependence.
Well, I mean, first of all, to say that it doesn't just mean dependence is to go against what Aquinas himself explicitly says in more than one place. So that's a textual answer. But also, he also is very clear that the will of God is not really distinct from God or from the divine essence. So what does it add, so to speak? If God's will were distinct from God or from the divine essence, you would have, first of all, you're not a Thomist at that point. You have all sorts of problems, because if it's not God, then you have exactly the problems that Plotinus raises when he insists that the production of being is not an act of will. Because it's just then that will comes in between the first and beings. It is itself something produced, and you're going to be into an infinite regress then, And for all of those same reasons, Aquinas insists that it isn't, the God's will is not really distinct from God. So I don't think you're going to get anywhere, so to speak, by raising that, by bringing that in as if it were some additional explanatory factor, as though we could say, okay, God, just as God doesn't account for the existence of things, you have to add God's will to explain why why there's a created world. Well, that's bad philosophy. it's bad metaphysics, and it's not Aquinas, because he is so clear. No real distinctions in God. He also is very clear, and this is in connection with the notion of creation as nothing but dependence, that when we attribute creation to God as an act, that act is nothing but the divine essence itself, considered by us with a relation to beings, to creatures as their cause, but that relation itself, once again, is nothing real in God. So it seems to me that Aquinas really, for good philosophical reasons, he undoes what might be done by bringing in creation as an act distinct from God himself, creation as an act of will, God's will distinct from God himself. It's like he says all of that, and then he kind of puts it sous hauteur, as we say today. He erases it again. Partly, some people have suggested that what's going on in Aquinas in that respect is a kind of a different registers of discourse. That when he's speaking in a more, devotional, in some sense, religious mode, so he freely uses these expressions like the divine will and God acts, create, and so on. And when he is speaking in a more strictly, rigorously philosophic mode, he says, he speaks in a different way and says these other things. If you wanted to be more negative, you could just say he's inconsistent. But the more charitable way of reading it, perhaps, is this different kind of modes or registers of discourse that he's working in. And the same thing could be said in some respects, I suppose, of the way in which, for example, Plotinus, when he's really doing this sort of rigorous discursive philosophizing, says, the one is not anything, beyond being, meaning not included in being, and all of that. But there are these other places where you get this very strong sense of devotion, of raising oneself toward the one, of prayer to the one. Even that very enigmatic passage, which I don't know what to make of, where he says the one is gentle and welcoming, and and things like that. Again, it seems to be some kind of different kinds of discourse going on.
Thanks. Yeah, and then I had another follow-up about Aquinas. So how exactly are you thinking about this actus purus stuff? So like when I'm reading Thinking Being and I come across your passages talking about like the fundamental difference between Aristotle and Plotinus and Aquinas is, for Aristotle and Zeta, you have being as form, being really like the primary thing he's going after. Whereas obviously, as we've talked about here, in Plotinus and Aquinas, you have why is being at all. And so for Aristotle, you say God, or the unmoved mover, is just form, pure form.
Let me just interrupt there just for a moment, because I did say that, and I have said that. I would no longer put it that way, simply because, in all fairness, Aristotle never actually refers to the unmoved mover as form.
Okay.
And I think that the reason for that is that for him, the word form always is correlative with matter, so that you can only talk about the form of something, not pure form by itself. What he does say, though, is that the unmoved mover is ousia.
Yeah.
Being as intelligible, being, what this, it comes to the same thing. It's really terminological matter, but it's not accurate to Aristotle's own texts, to say that he refers to the unmoved mover as pure form. Just to
okay, that makes a lot more sense, because my question is going to be basically, how do you square the first way of Aquinas with the argument in Metaphysics Lambda and in Physics Book 8? Because I don't know if there's really a difference between them yet. If you say that, Aristotle's God is form and, Aquinas is beyond that, that was basically going to be it. So I guess you would respond with a distinction that you just made.
Can
I'm not sure that's going to help.
Jump in here?
But, yeah.
Sorry, just to add to that question a little bit. Plotinus also critiques Aristotle's unmoved mover as just being equivalent to nous, thought thinking itself, right? So how would you square, I guess, Aquinas with Aristotle with Plotinus' critique of Aristotle?
that's a big problem. So let me try to take these things, first one and then the other. You may have noticed that in everything I write that touches on Aquinas, I say very, very little, almost nothing about the five ways, with the partial exception of the fourth, and instead go to the arguments in De Ante Licentia.
Yep.
And in question 44, I guess it is, of the Summa, which is very, very closely parallel to the fourth way. I don't think much of the other four of the five ways. And it seems to me that the best you could say for Aquinas there is that he's just sort of trying to point people in the direction of a first principle. And then later, then he continues and goes on and works out much more thoroughly what we can and can't say about first principle, what it is and what it isn't, and so on. Surely, at a minimum, we've got to say that there's a tremendous difference, isn't there, between a first which is the cause of motion on the one hand, and a first which is a cause of being.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And we know that Aquinas goes to the first which is the cause of being, in which case you have to ask, what's the first of the five ways doing there? Because it only talks about motion. I've had a student once who, I think based on what he'd been taught in some other class, it said, thought about thinking of it in terms of, okay, you've got this whole series of dominoes, and something has to push the first one to start them all going, and that's sort of the sort of thing that's going on in the first way. And so, no, wait a minute, no, that's not what Aquinas God is supposed to account for. It's supposed to account for that there are dominoes there at all. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Not what starts the series falling, So all of that is to a certain extent to kind of dismiss the first way. But
can I just say one quick thing about that? So It seems to me like, I don't know if you're familiar with Garrigou-Lagrange's work at all. Father Garrigou-Lagrange, pretty big Thomist. It seems like he takes the first way as like being like the driving force in his systematic work through of Thomism. He goes from that argument to actus purus, and then from there he gets to divine simplicity and all the attributes. So I'm definitely going to reflect on that, but it's just kind of
I was going to say this: if we understand motion, as I think Aristotle does, to include to mean actualization of any sort.
Okay.
Then we're much closer, because then if we then have the idea of esse as the act of acts, then we can sort of reinterpret the first of the five ways along those lines. That we're not talking about motion in anything like the ordinary sense of the term. We're talking about actualization, and even
actualization of existence.
Even if there were motionless beings, they still need to be actualized, right? That's what you get in that's the sort of thing you get in Plotinus. So that's one thing. But that's what's going on in Plotinus, right? He argues that ousia, which means being qua intelligible, is necessarily determinate. As determinate, it's conditioned, therefore it's actualized, it's not pure actuality. That's where I could see you could draw a line through from Parmenides to Aquinas on that. Now, let me take up Marcus, is that the name? Yeah, Marcus' question, which I think that's much trickier, actually, to deal with, because it seems to me that Aquinas is trying to have it both ways. He wants, on the one hand, his God is the, so to speak, corresponding to the Neoplatonic one, not anything, stands outside the order of beings, absolutely simple, in such a way that even to say that is already to introduce complexity to it. He wants to have all of that, and in a certain sense he does have all of that, but his God is also thought thinking itself, the divine intellect, along the lines of Aristotle and Augustine. And that's where I have to say I'm not sure that Aquinas can pull it off. Can he get away with having it both ways? I think he tries to. I'm not sure he succeeds. So that you may there, I'm inclined to think, be onto a real problem in Aquinas. And what I'm doing in these couple of things that I've written here is try to articulate, pull out one side of that, the Neoplatonic side, to the neglect, frankly, of the other side.
That brings. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
That problem in Aquinas, what you're thinking of as a problem in Aquinas, to be connected to this, I think it's implicitly a problem in your paper, Proclus, multi-level ontology.
Yeah, I point to it there. Yeah,
it's the same problem. It's a problem with taking all the beings and sort of unifying them in God, right?
Yeah.
And because Aquinas does that, you think he can't account for all the beings, everything else.
Yeah, that was where I did refer to that. Let me say, though, that I've recently, in connection with some work I've been doing on Aristotle, been reading a couple of people who try, so to speak, to reconcile, not to favor one, I think not so much to favor one over the other, but to reconcile Aristotle and Plotinus on that problem. And if they could successfully do that, then I think that perhaps that same reconciliation might be applicable to Aquinas. There's an interesting paper by Horst Seidel on Plotinus and Aristotle on this point, and Thomas de Koning, and he's done some very interesting work on how to understand the simplicity of thought thinking itself in Aristotle, where Plotinus argues, no, if it's thought thinking itself, it's not absolutely simple. And both of them are trying to not, it seems to me, not exactly to say that Plotinus just got Aristotle wrong, but to say that there is a way of reading them that overcomes the opposition between them on that. So that's something I want to look into further, but I don't have more to say about that right now.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. So we're nearing about 2 hours. Thank you so much, Dr. Phil, for how many questions you've answered and all your generous thoughts you provided. And I just wanted to quickly turn to a question that Trent had because his mic wasn't out. So his mic wasn't, he couldn't use his mic. So I'll just read out his question. So Trent says that, so it seems like an object which neither exists nor not exists is a self-contradiction and thus would not exist. So, for example, the set of sets, which are not members of themselves, is a self-contradictory object. So the way to resolve it is to simply say it doesn't exist. So, and then further, in other words, it seems as though God would be incoherent on this model. And
I must pass beyond God into a desert.
Yeah. I guess, and then finally, why not instead say something like I have an analogical understanding of existence where we say, there's, in some sense, God doesn't exist in the sense that we exist, but on a higher sense, in another sense, which doesn't have to do with being conditioned, God does exist. So why not say something like that, I guess?
A couple of reasons. Well, one is arguably that's terminological. If you want to put it that way with enough caveats and explanation of what you mean and what you don't mean, you can get away with it. But those explanations are going to have to do an awful lot of work if we're going to avoid coming to a God which is a being, which is determinate, conditioned, and therefore is not God. So yes, for certain, in a way, it's a matter of registers of discourse again. For a certain kind of discourse, yes, you can talk that way, but without an awful lot of explanation, it's more misleading than not. And what I'm always afraid of is we're going to end up with, we're going to end up thinking of God as a something, and that's not God. To put it in theological terms, we're going to end up with an idol, or what Jean-Luc Marion calls a conceptual idol. Because we're trying to get there, we're trying to insist that there's got to be something there to get hold of. And my point repeatedly is that, and I think it's Plotinus' point as well, and on a charitable reading, what from my point of view is a charitable reading of Aquinas, his point as well. If you can get hold of it, it's not God. Such a God who is something, is not worthy of being called God. So yes, we can speak that way, but there's always this danger of using that kind of discourse to bring God down to the level of something intellectually manageable. And then it's not going to be God. And losing sight, is that the right word to use when you're talking about into the dark? Yeah. Losing sight of what Maritain called the sacred abyss.
And so just one follow-up from Trent, he just wants, so would that amount to an epistemological claim that God is not a comprehensible object, or is it an ontological claim that God does not exist?
It's both at once. Again, instead of saying does not exist, see, it's always a being that does or does not exist. I can say, a unicorn does not exist, but a unicorn is a definite something, not nothing. And I don't want to frame, say either God exists or, that, is that part of the problem, right? Is that's exactly the way in a modern context, that's exactly the way this debate gets carried out. Does God exist or does God not exist? And what both sides are usually arguing is, well, they're both missing God. They're thinking of God as if we were talking about a unicorn, and then we're going to examine the world, not empirically in this case, but in some other way, and find out whether there is something that meets that description, or not. And they're just not talking about what ought to be meant by God. As long as we're in that mode of discourse. So, no, I wouldn't say God does not exist, nor would I like to say God does exist, but I prefer the language of saying God is not a being. And if we want to say God is not a being, rather, God is being itself, that's okay, as long as we realize that we're talking about two different terms here, right? In the Latin, ens and esse. Otherwise, it's just sheer self-contradiction and incoherence to say God is not being, God is being. So I think this is very largely a terminological issue. But what I do want to always raise objections to, and you can see even in as classical and traditional and committed a Thomist as, say, John Whipple, he sets it up this way. What I want to avoid is having any kind of larger totality that would include as members both God and all the things that are not God. And that's where I don't think the word existence, well, I would say the danger of using existence in that way is that it suggests such a totality. That's where Duns Scotus goes. And with that, we're at the beginning of everything going wrong. That there's this larger totality, and then within it you can have infinite being and finite beings, or infinite existence and finite existence, however, whichever terminology you want to use, and so on. But you always have this larger totality within which God is one very special member, as distinct from the other members. And what I'm trying to avoid, and I think that Whipple, to cite a very, very traditional sort of person, as well as, for example, Jean-Luc Marion, to cite a very untraditional sort of person, are both right in saying that what's going on in Aquinas' doctrine of analogy is precisely not that. It's not to say that there is this larger totality that embraces, so to speak, both God and creatures, but rather to deny that there is any such totality. That's what I want to keep the focus on. Whatever terminology we use, and there's room for different ways of articulating it, but we've got to avoid having God as one member along with other members of a larger totality. As long as we avoid that, then I'm not too worried about what exact terminology we use.
One, can I just add here, and thank you for spending so much time with us. Once you make the one completely transcendent and beyond any member of beings, it seems like you run into another problem, which is you still have to talk about actuality, causality. In theophany, you talk about the one as pure production, and you can't isolate the one itself from its activity of producing and creating the world, creating all beings. But once you talk about the one as pure production or pure actuality, it seems like it's unavoidably relating it to beings and the creation of beings. Once you have that relation, I mean, I think as you noted in your really early papers from the 90s, it seems like you have to conflate the one and the many on some level. Otherwise, it just seems like you're falling into antinomies either way.
Yeah, it seems to me that there are two different problems there. With regard to the one and the many issue, we always have to remember that the one is not one. Right? That's not an attribute that this it supposedly has. Right? So it's not that the one is one and other things are many or something like that. So that's not going to be an issue. But I would argue it the other way around. I'm not entirely sure I would continue with my language of pure productivity or something like that. I've replaced that, but with recognizing the shortcomings of this language too, with this notion of condition and the conditioned. But be that as it which, but you could very well make the same argument there, right? That it still implies a relation. But I would argue the other way around, actually, that it's a producer that exercises an activity of producing that constitutes a relation. Such a producer is related to its products. But this notion of sheer productivity or unconditioned condition, without any such distinction, is intended precisely to deny such a relation.
This is love or giving, but it seems like you have a relationality with that.
Again, to be a lover is to be in relation, but love itself, just love, again, it's impossible to think, of course, right? Just love, which is not the act of a thing which is doing the act of loving. But I think that's exactly, in Plotinus doesn't use the language of love, of course, because for him it does that implies lack, need, and so on. Except in one passage where he's not talking about the one in relation to beings, but only itself, the love of itself, and so on, which I think he's meaning unrelated to anything is what he means by that. But be that as it may, Plotinus does use the language of giving. But again, what does he explain that means? He uses one of the best expressions, I think, the power of all things. Not a thing which exercises power and thereby produces other things. That takes place within the realm of beings. But just power, which I think is very much another way of saying condition. And his point of saying that, is precisely not to affirm a relation, but rather to deny any relation. Proclus arguably goes further, because he recognizes that the word cause indicates a relation, and so he denies even that. If you really look carefully at Book 3 of the Platonic Theology, he says we have to go beyond one which is the cause of beings, because that's related to beings.
Right. Then it seems like
away even cause.
Seems like you make it too isolated, and then it's just one and not many anymore, but it has to somehow be both. But once it's both, it has to be in relation. It can't be totally isolated anymore.
I think what you're touching on here is something I've talked about in many places, and that is this identity of transcendence and immanence. right? Or Dionysius, right? He's the one who uses the language of love to express what I think same basic idea that you have in Plotinus, just not using that language. That
in this creation.
But what does that mean? Does it mean anything other or more than they're being conditioned? They're related, the dependency in that sense of conditionedness of beings qua beings. Right? That's what I keep arguing. Notice that means it's a one-sided relation. Right? Now that's what all of these philosophers are saying. That beings are related to the principle is not related to the beings. But for that reason, they have to take away the word principle. You're still thinking something, right? There's still some definite intelligible content involved when you're thinking cause, maker, producer, any kind of thing, and anything like that. And that's what we have to keep taking away. We always have to realize that whatever we think, again, it's not first. It's not the unconditioned, because whatever we think is, as this is right, isn't this what you're saying? That it is in relation. But that means that no matter what name we use, productivity, power, condition, love, giving, as long as that still expresses some intelligible content, we're not where we need to be. And right. So that's why all of these people keep saying, God, negate, take away, right. Take away everything. And I just think that so often, this takes us back to the very origins of this paper. So often we fail to realize the full force of the word everything. And that's where that fear and trembling.
So the priority is on the negation. That's where the priority of negation over analogy, I guess, in Proclus.
Okay, but again, realize we have to negate the negations, right? Remember that line? Is all of this true of the one? Absolutely not. Are all these negations true of it? Absolutely not. Proclus is funnier than I think people often realize that he is. But I think there is an element of humor there, but not just a meaningless joke, right? Are we to say that all of these negations are true of it? Absolutely not. And again, that means we have to, I won't say quite stop thinking. Plotinus does say, right, you will not think. But the reason I don't want quite to say stop thinking is that suggests a final point that you could just reach once and for all again. But I will say we always have to be progressively unthinking, something like that, unknowing, for the reason that I've talked about. As long as you've got any content of thought, therefore any thinking, you haven't got the first. You're still with something conditioned. So
yeah, I guess we would have to negate even the term pure production, like you're suggesting.
Absolutely, you have to negate everything, but I think we fail to realize adequately what that really means, and only the
negate everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's only the. I hate to use this word because it can be so misleading. The mystics, in this dialectical sense of mysticism, but it's not, just something you just, do one afternoon in an armchair, right? I think this is sort of what Father Silouan was getting at. But those in any tradition, you can find parallels in the Hindu tradition, after all, probably in Buddhism too. I don't know. I know even less about that than about Hinduism. But it's only those who really live out, as I think Armstrong talks about, Mother Maria, living out the apophatic way. Probably you could say that of Plotinus. I'm not sure you could say it of Proclus, who are the people we're talking about here. But at least we can, if not be there ourselves, we can philosophically articulate what it is that they are doing.
Great.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to say, I think maybe if you could articulate that, that would address my concerns earlier about the mood and so forth. But thank you.
I know we're 10 minutes over, so thank you so much, Dr. Perl, for how generous you've been. Would it be okay if Father Silouan asked one final question, and then we'll?
It's okay with me.
Is that okay? Okay. Well,
it's a very simple question. Probably too simplistic, but it goes back to the discussion on Aquinas. There is a tendency in the polemics between Orthodox theologians and the Thomists to think of Aquinas as ultimately an ontotheist. And but one of the interesting things that you brought up in the paper and that you've kept on going back to is the fact that he is actually in continuity with the tradition of the of Plotinus and Proclus and the understanding of God beyond being. And so you would definitely posit that there are two Thomases in his writings. And then there's
that's just a little too strong. I wouldn't say definitely posit, but I'm inclined to think that. Yeah.
And so would you say that there's a difference between Thomas and then the Thomism that has developed from his writings?
And how?
Yeah.
This is where, throughout my whole career, I've had this sort of love-hate relationship with the Thomists, because on the one hand, well, there are a couple of things there. One is that although I, in so many ways, disagree with them, they're among the very few people I'm able to have any kind of conversation with, because they're engaged with, they take classical metaphysics seriously, even if I think they're wrong about some things within it. Whereas almost everybody else does, you can't have this kind of conversation at all. But the other thing is that I had to learn is that to pay attention to Thomas rather than to the Thomists, especially though many, not all Thomists. Let me give you an example. There's a wonderful book by Philip Roseman called. He likes to give his books titles in other languages. It's in French, but the title is Omne ens est aliquid. Every being is something, where he sort of unfolds the whole of Thomas's philosophy from the point of view of aliquid, which doesn't just mean something; it means distinct, something else, something distinct from something else. From aliquid as a transcendental. You could say that in this book, at any rate, he's a Thomist, but he's not a Gilsonian Thomist. He's not a Gary-Lagrange Thomist. So it's a certain kind of Thomists who, for a long time, in the mid and into the later 20th century, were the Thomists that I really find myself at odds with. There are people who would consider themselves Thomists who are reading Thomas in much more like the way I am reading Thomas now. That's what I guess what I would get at. But those mid 20th century Thomists can be a real problem, and they're still, despite what Wayne Hankey used to say to me, they're still with us. They're still around. You should have seen the reader's report that I got on this very paper from one of them. And it was just so easy to identify. Oh, it's one of those people. I could guess who it is, except that they're all the same, so you can't guess who it is. And I could know exactly what he was going to say. I mean, it's like a machine almost. That they've got this kind of pre-packaged answers to everying, and it drives me crazy. So that kind of Thomist, and as I say, they're still around. There I would very strongly differentiate Thomas from that sort of Thomist.
Thank you, Professor. Man, thank you for everyone. I have to depart now, but thank you for everything.
Yeah, thanks.
It's been a wonderful discussion.
Thanks for your questions, Father Silouan.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so thanks everyone for coming and for your great questions, and then thanks most of all to Dr. Perl for how generous you were with your time and your fantastic answers. And
thanks. All of the questions and discussion have brought to my mind some things I need to pay more attention to or articulate better, and so on as well. So,
wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.